George Fieldman. I'm a consultant psychologist at the King Edward VII Hospital in London. And my background is that I started off life as a physiologist, and then I gradually moved into psychology, academic psychology, and from there I moved into cognitive behavioral therapy. So one of the very interesting things about my journey, as it were, is that most people don't have a deep understanding of the relevance of evolutionary biology to psychology and psychotherapy. And that's the purpose of my talk today, is to elaborate upon that relevance of our biological origins and how they work for us today. So if we could have the next slide, please, that would be great. Thank you very much. So the learning objectives are to understand the principles of evolutionary human psychology, and to recognize how evolved mechanisms shape emotion and behavior, and to appreciate the evolutionary perspectives within evidence-based therapies, and to apply evolutionary concepts to routine psychotherapy. So just very briefly on that, most of us are kind of focused in our minds upon the so if I'm hungry, which I am because I haven't had breakfast, I'm just thinking about feeling hungry and planning to eat something. But the evolutionary purpose of me being hungry is to take on board sufficient nourishment, calories, in order to function. Now, I'm not thinking about nourishment and calories. I'm just thinking in my mind, I want to eat something. I'm feeling hungry. But there's that. It's important to realize that to have that evolutionary perspective as to why I feel hungry. There is a biological purpose to it, but I'm only basically aware of what's called the proximal thing. In other words, my desire to eat. Hopefully that'll become clearer as we go forward. If we could have the next slide, please, that would be very helpful. So, what is evolutionary psychology? Well, the idea is that behavior is guided by adaptive goals: survival, reproduction, nurturing offspring, and cooperation. Now, traditional psychological models focus upon how symptoms occur. An evolutionary model explains why such mechanisms exist at all, both in psychological health and in illness. And so this approach provides the ultimate fundamental explanation for various psychological phenomena, in addition to the usual so-called proximate causes. So the proximate cause would be something like if I tread on a drawing pin, I will yelp and be in pain, and I won't do anything until I get rid of the drawing pin from the heel of my foot. So the proximate cause of my action is to stop the pain. But the ultimate cause is to not impair my chances of survival. Because if I want to go to eat, to hunt, to gather, to procreate, I can't do that very well if I'm in pain. And so that's a distinction of the difference between a short-term cause, pain in my foot, versus the wider consequence of that is that if I'm damaged, that I won't be able to function so well. But we're not really thinking about, passing on our genes in that context. We're just thinking about the pain in our foot. And this is part of the purpose of my talk, is to highlight this interesting kind of difference. So if we could have the next slide, please. So what motivates human beings? Well, our minds are shaped by natural and sexual selection. Our brains evolved. The brain evolution has given rise to psychological so-called modules to solve problems that existed in the ancestral environment. Modern human beings are still principally motivated to seek out things that were both essential and rare in the ancestral environment. That is something that was required for personal or genetic survival. For example, food, warmth, and romantic partners. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, so for example, later today I'm going for a lunch with a very attractive woman. I'm not thinking about passing on my genes. She's postmenopausal. I'm 69 years of age. That's not what I'm thinking of. But that's the fundamental reason why I am looking forward to going for lunch with my attractive friend. I'm just aware of wanting the company and looking forward to meeting a beautiful woman. But that's not the biological purpose. The biological purpose has been rendered redundant by menopause and so forth. But the subroutines in my mind keep on carrying on, independently of their biological utility, because we are in a sense living fossils, if that makes any sense to the audience. Okay, if we could have the next slide, please. So the purpose of an evolutionary psychological analysis of emotions is that it will provide a unifying framework linking biology and psychology. So fear will make us try and avoid dangers. Anger will make us trying to defend, fear will make us avoid danger. Anger will make us try and defend resources. Disgust will make us try and avoid contamination. Hunger will make us acquire nutrition. Romantic attraction, the purpose of that is to pass on one's genes. Envy, involving typically two people, will make us compete to acquire resources, which will be relevant to the ultimate passing on one's genes. And jealousy, which is three people, involves mate guarding, preserving one's genetic investment. So emotions are adaptive signals, and psychopathology arises when there is an excessive or misplaced activation of one of these biologically derived emotional features, as it were. I hope I'm making sense to people. If there's anything that people want to stop me and ask me questions about, if it's possible to do that, I'd be very pleased to take any questions, either as we go or at the end. Okay, if we could have the next slide, please. So, no, hang on, we're going back. Two slides back, please. Back one more. Okay, forward one. Okay. No, forward one. Go on forward. We're going backwards. One forward again. That's it. Why is anxiety prevalent? Well, anatomically, modern humans emerged 300,000 years ago. Now, the homicide rate then is uncertain. If you look at the literature, it's difficult to discern. You get wildly different figures. But death by violence was definitely far more common, and it could have been maybe as high as 1 in 20. Maybe it was 1 in 50. It's difficult to be sure. Today in Britain, the homicide rate is 1 in 100,000. Compared with 1 in 20, that's a 5,000-fold greater risk in our ancestral history than it is today. So the correlation between danger and fear, which was once very strong, is now, thankfully, very poor. So fear and danger are poorly correlated. That's because we're living in an environment which is relatively safe. But we were designed to live in an environment which is much more dangerous. And the evolutionary explanation for why anxiety is so prevalent is that we are physiologically primed to be in fight or flight mode to enable us to cope better with an attack or to run away, which thankfully in the modern world is a very rare phenomenon. So we're typically sort of, we might be having cognitive therapy, or we might be taking anxiolytic drugs to try and make us feel less anxious, but the real issue is that we're basically not fit for the purpose we're in living currently. We're designed for a much more violent and dangerous human context. So this is kind of like a very sort of interesting phenomenon. There's a mismatch between the way we're designed and the environment we're living in. And if we could have the next slide, please. So obesity is a very common problem. Obesity is defined as a BMI of over 30 and is a worldwide and growing problem. So the body mass index, if over 30 is defined as obese. In the UK, some 20% of the population are obese, and 5% of all deaths are attributed to obesity. That's an amazing statistic to me. 20%, 1 in 5 of the UK population are obese, and 5% of deaths are attributed to obesity. Why? Well, fundamentally, from an evolutionary biological perspective, food was both essential and rare in the ancestral environment. So that would mean essential and rare codes for we've been designed to run to get it. Hence, we have a powerful drive to find and eat food, and as I said, this would have been selected for in evolutionary history. Fast forward to the 21st century, we've developed a continuous food supply. But we lack a hunger drive promoting us to eat only in proportion to our calorific requirements. Satiety mechanisms were hardly required ancestrally because everyone was hungry. So it's another example of how we are designed to be in a different context, and you shift people into a world where food is constantly available. They overeat, and they not only do they overeat, 5% of deaths in the UK are attributed to this overeating. So it's like another interesting example of being like a fish out of water, and it's very telling and very, very troubling, and we need to kind of pay attention to it, I think. Okay, next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about depression, which is a very common problem. Again, very prevalent. 5% of the UK population at any one time are depressed, and typically arise out of failure, characterized by negative thoughts or self-censure. Mild depression, however, can invoke what's called depressive realism, a more balanced self-perception and self-appraisals that coincide with the opinions of objective observers. Now, if we have a positive self-conception, it's associated with working harder and longer at tasks, which of course would code for actually achieving one's goal. So it's possible that mild depression may have actually evolved to have a role in correcting arrogant self-perceptions. In addition, interestingly, exercise, as shown by the work of Michael Argyll at Oxford many years ago, was shown to have a role in elevating mood. And of course, exercise is something most human beings do not enough of. I have a cross trainer myself in the house, and I force myself to do it, but it's not as consistent as it should be, or as I would like it to be, because there's not the motivation to do it, because ancestrally you had to exercise to eat. Now we don't, so we tend to under-exercise. But exercise induces mood elevation, and this may have facilitated the spread of genes for bipolar disorder, because in the modern world, if somebody is bipolar, which is a very heritable condition, they can take to their beds for a month if they feel so inclined. Now, ancestrally, that wouldn't have been possible. You'd have to pull your weight, and so they would have kind of dragged you out of bed to go and hunt and gather. And that would have given you mood elevation. And because with bipolar, you get this manic phase, in which people are very, very productive, it could have been less of a problem, paradoxically, ancestrally, than in the modern world. Very, very interesting phenomenon. If we could have the next slide, please. Talked a little bit about envy and jealousy. Envy typically involves two people and promotes competition for scarce resources. Jealousy is regarded as involving three people, which promotes mate guarding behaviors, particularly in men. And jealousy is often an interesting and often intense emotion. It's not designed to protect the individual experiencing it, but rather their investment in their offspring to ensure that they in fact are genetically related. So if a man sees his wife um, flirting with another man, his fear would be non-conscious but biologically derived, that if she gets pregnant by another man, that he will be investing scarce resources in somebody else's genes. And that's why it's a telling emotion, which everybody is capable of. Interestingly, the advent of contraception makes it easy to have sexual partnerships without having offspring. But the advent of contraception, whilst it can very reliably prevent offspring from arising from sexual activity with so-called extra pair matings or affairs in human current parlance, it doesn't reduce the intensity of the experience of jealousy, which is because our minds were designed before contraception became available, which is kind of interesting. There's a little grammatical error of mine just there. Should be available. So it's kind of interesting that it's a very widespread phenomenon, doesn't help the individual, unlike the experience of pain to stop us injuring ourselves and so forth. It tries to protect our genetic investments. It's a very, very interesting phenomenon. Okay, if we could have the next slide, please. So kin altruism, when I was a postdoc at Oxford, it was a very prestigious department. When I'd arrived, a dozen years before I'd arrived, they'd won a Nobel Prize. And there was this professor in the department who was a Royal Society research professor at the time. His name was W.D. Hamilton. And he evolved this rule called RB is greater than C, where R is coefficient of relatedness, genetic similarity. B is the benefit to the recipient, and C is the cost to the actor. So in evolutionary biology, behavioral biology, this is a very famous phenomenon, kind of unheard of in psychology and psychotherapy. But basically, it explains why we are so dramatically involved in caring for our children, because basically having children is the sole route to biological immortality or something akin to it. So I've got 3 sons. I've invested very heavily in them. One is won 2 bronze medals at 2 Olympic Games. The other one is a doctor, went to Cambridge and stuff. So I've invested heavily to help my children. But the biological reason is that I know they're my children, and therefore I act in accordance with that and try and promote their success. If we could have the next slide, please. So altruism towards kin evolved because it enhances gene-level success rather than individual self-sacrifice. Humans evolved psychological mechanisms, emotions like affection, empathy, and guilt, that promote kin-directed helping behavior. So, I feel affection, empathy, and if there's, I ever shout at my children or something, that I'd easily feel guilt and so forth, because I want to preserve them, because they are basically genetically related to me. About 50% of one's genes who come up with one's offspring. Okay, if we could have the next slide, please. So we did this study in which I was involved at Oxford. It wasn't my designer study, it was my colleagues at Oxford who designed it. And we found that participants were generally more willing to incur the cost when the beneficiary is more closely related to them. And there was a cost of doing a skiing experiment, which you're sitting up against a wall without a chair. And the longer they sat and endured the pain, the more money they earned for a relative. And we found that the closer the relative, the more pain they would endure. And this supports the idea that kinship directly influences altruistic behavior. Very interesting. And the pattern held across 2 cultural samples, both Oxford and London, and in Africa, indicating a cross-cultural robustness to this phenomenon. I was very privileged to be a part of that study. I didn't design it, but I was just a postdoc on it. But it was very interesting and important. If we could have the next slide, please. So this is an interesting point about contraception. Basically, it's an evolutionary experiment. So sexual desire evolved to promote spreading of our genes. Now, if there's any genetically derived desire to have children, natural selection will act upon it. This means that people who have a randomly stronger desire to have children will inevitably choose to have more offspring. People with a weaker desire to have children will choose to have fewer children. And this is independent of the desire to have sex per se. So the understanding of reproductive biology has enabled humans to cleave the previous linkage between sex and reproduction. It's a very interesting point. Understanding of reproductive biology has enabled humans to cleave the normal linkage between sex and reproduction. Next slide, please. So from an evolutionary perspective, it seems likely that the desire to have children is being acted upon by natural selection right now. This means that people who have a high sex drive and low desire for children will be outcompeted by those with a high desire for both sex and offspring. When I say outcompeted, I mean in terms of offspring, numbers of offspring. Hence, over time, the nature of our biological psychology may be changing. And if this is the case, our future selves may come to desire children with a comparable intensity to the desire we currently feel to have sexual attraction. The consequence of this may be a population explosion a few hundred or thousand years down the line, such that we may urgently require a planet B to cope with the numbers. Very interesting. Next slide, please. So our evolutionary psychological design suited us to survive and thrive in environments that are very different to those that we enjoy today. Another example is oxygen. Oxygen is essential for human life, but because it was ubiquitous all over the very common completely in the ancestral environment, we possess surprisingly poor physiological systems to monitor its level in the body. If you go up in an aircraft and go to 10,000 meters, and the compressors are switched off in the aircraft, alveolar oxygen pressure falls from about 100 at sea level to 25 millimeters of mercury, and blood saturation falls below 50%. Consciousness is then lost. But astonishingly, people under these circumstances hardly notice the danger. They don't get angry or panic. They just lose consciousness, and ultimately, if the aircraft goes high, they will actually die completely. So, in contrast, we are highly sensitive to rising carbon dioxide, which is which gives rise to intense psychological and physiological distress. Next slide, please. So there's a mismatch problem. Ancestral life and modern environments are very different. We have a sedentary lifestyle, 24-hour stimulation, adverse social media comparisons promoting anxiety, depression, obesity, and addiction. Hence, as psychotherapists, we should frame our interventions towards restoring a better environmental fit, especially including sleep, exercise, and social contact. So the point about the psychological point about the mismatch problem I was mentioning is that social contact was ubiquitous ancestrally, and so just like the low levels of oxygen, we're not strongly driven to get it. But we know that people living alone are more likely to die young. So we desperately need social contact. We don't have the same drive to get it as we do to avoid physical pain. Very interesting. Next slide, please. So this is the definition of psychosis. So traditional definitions of psychosis involved the thought that emotions, that thought and emotions are affected such that contact with reality is lost. But work on cognitive bias has illustrated to us that to some degree, everyone's cognitions fail to represent reality accurately. And a key evolutionary psychological explanation for this is that human cognition evolved to promote survival, not principally to perceive reality accurately, and certainly not to acquire comfort. Indeed, discomfort motivates action. Hence the special value of authentic science, which can provide humans with an unbiased and hence precious snapshot of reality. Evolutionary psychotherapy helps to provide a grounded perspective to reframe and recalibrate ancient threat detection systems. Next slide, please. So, in conclusion, evolutionary biology is fundamental to a comprehensive understanding of human psychology. Evolutionary processes can give rise to a diverse range of consequences. These range from altruistic love humans bestow upon their children to the instinct for territoriality, leading to the development of weapons of mass destruction. To promote the prospects of living a benign and safe world, it is essential that we understand deeply our fundamental natures as derived from evolution by natural selection. Our principal motivations to acquire things that ancestrally were essential but rare. We need to use modern understanding to ask ourselves first what we need, i.e., what is good for us, rather than just what do we actually want, which is a different question. Next slide, please. So there's a quote from Charles Darwin: "Man, with all his noble qualities, still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin." So said Charles Darwin. And the last slide, I believe, is just the references. Thank you very much. Was that any questions on that?